Before we begin, consider a possibility that completely changes the meaning of one of the most famous myths ever told. What if Icarus did not fall because he was reckless? What if he fell because he understood exactly what he was doing? For centuries, people have treated the story as a warning. A lesson about arrogance. A cautionary tale about ignoring limits. Fly too high, get punished. Simple. Clean. Easy to remember. And yet, there is something strange about that interpretation. If the myth is only about the danger of ambition, why has humanity spent thousands of years celebrating people who did exactly what Icarus did? Why do we admire explorers who crossed oceans no one believed could be crossed? Why do we remember artists who sacrificed comfort for vision? Why do we tell stories about inventors, rebels, pioneers, and dreamers who walked straight toward risks everyone else avoided? The contradiction sits right in front of us. We say Icarus is a warning. But we build entire civilizations around people who refuse to stay safely on the ground. And that raises a much bigger question. Maybe the story was never really about falling. Maybe it was about the decision to fly. Think about the image that survived across thousands of years, not a king, not a soldier, not a conqueror. What remains is a young man suspended between the sea below and the sun above. A pair of wings. An impossible sky. A single choice. That image became immortal for a reason. Because Icarus is not merely a character. He is a role. He represents a force that appears in every generation, the person who sees a boundary and feels compelled to test it. Not because success is guaranteed, but because something beyond the boundary keeps calling. And here is where the myth becomes unsettling. The traditional interpretation assumes that survival is the highest value. It assumes that staying safe is obviously the correct choice. But what if not everyone agrees? What if some people would rather risk everything for a moment of meaning than spend a lifetime protected from failure? Suddenly, the story changes. The sun stops being a physical object. It becomes a symbol. A symbol of the thing that exists. Beyond certainty. Beyond permission. Beyond safety. The thing that attracts human beings precisely because it is dangerous. That is why the image of melting wings continues to haunt us. Not because it represents defeat, but because it forces us to confront a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What is the point of surviving if you never become who you were capable of being? And perhaps that is why Icarus still matters. Not because he teaches us where the limit is, but because he forces us to ask why limits exist at all. The strange thing is that the more closely we look at this myth, the less it resembles a lesson about arrogance and the more it resembles a mystery about freedom. A mystery that becomes even deeper when we ask a question almost nobody asks. What, exactly, was Icarus searching for in the first place? If Icarus was searching for something, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What stood in his way? Most people would answer, the sun. But that answer may be too simple. Because every meaningful story contains two kinds of obstacles. The visible obstacle and the invisible one. The visible obstacle is what destroys you. The invisible obstacle is what defines you. And in the case of Icarus, the invisible obstacle may not have been above him in the sky at all. It may have been the ancient conflict that has followed humanity from the beginning, the tension between safety and possibility. Notice how this conflict appears everywhere. Every civilization praises innovation, yet fears disruption. Every parent wants a child to succeed, yet worries about the risks required to become extraordinary. Every individual dreams of freedom, yet seeks protection from uncertainty. We want both. And that is the problem. Because there are moments when the two begin pulling in opposite directions. This is where the figure of Daedalus becomes fascinating, not as a father in a family drama, but as a symbol. He represents wisdom earned through experience. He represents survival. The voice that understands consequences before they arrive. In many ways, he is the voice most of us trust. The voice that says, be careful. Stay within the boundaries. Protect what you have. And to be clear, there is nothing irrational about that advice. In fact, most of human progress depends on people who know how to survive. But then a contradiction appears. History remembers the cautious architects. Yet it becomes obsessed with the people who crossed the line. Why? Why do we endlessly retell stories about those who ventured beyond the accepted limit? The answer may reveal something uncomfortable about human nature. Perhaps survival is not our highest value. Perhaps meaning is. Think about the symbols that remain from the myth. A pair of wings. A vast sky. A distant sun. And below, the open sea. These are not merely objects. They form a psychological landscape. The wings symbolize possibility. The sea symbolizes consequence. And the sun symbolizes something far more mysterious, the ideal that cannot be safely possessed. The thing that seems just beyond reach. The vision. The truth. The purpose. The version of ourselves we suspect exists somewhere beyond our current limits. And that changes everything. Because once the sun becomes symbolic, the story is no longer about one person. It becomes about everyone. The entrepreneur who leaves stability to pursue an uncertain idea. The artist who sacrifices comfort to create something meaningful. The scientist who challenges accepted beliefs. The individual who walks away from a life that feels secure but empty. Different centuries. Different faces. The same conflict. And here the consequence becomes larger than the myth itself. A society built entirely on safety eventually stops discovering. But a society built entirely on risk eventually destroys itself. Which means the real question is not whether limits should exist. The real question is where those limits belong. And who gets to decide them? That is why the image of Icarus continues to survive while countless other myths fade away. It touches a contradiction that never disappears. Human beings need boundaries. Yet something inside us is constantly trying to move beyond them. The more we examine this tension, the stranger the story becomes. Because if Icarus truly represents the desire to transcend limits, then the most important mystery is no longer whether he failed. The real mystery is whether he believed the journey itself was worth the cost. And if that possibility is true, then we are forced to confront a far more unsettling question. What if the thing Icarus was chasing was never the sun at all? But what if we have been looking for the wrong answer? Up to this point, the central question seems straightforward. What was worth risking so much for? What force could possibly pull someone beyond the safety of accepted limits? Yet there is a deeper contradiction hiding beneath that question. We assume that people move toward what they want. But some of the most important figures in human history seem to move toward something else entirely. Not certainty. Not success. Not even happiness. They move toward transformation. And that distinction changes everything. Because transformation is dangerous. The moment a person truly changes, they can never return to who they were before. That is why the real conflict inside the myth may not be between a young man and a distant symbol in the sky. It may be between two competing visions of life itself. One vision asks, how do I preserve what I have? The other asks, what am I willing to become? At first glance, these questions seem compatible. In reality, they often collide. Every major breakthrough in human civilization emerged from that collision. The explorers who crossed unknown waters did not know what they would find. The innovators who challenged accepted wisdom could not guarantee success. The artists who created entirely new forms of expression often faced rejection before recognition. What united them was not confidence. It was willingness. Willingness to enter uncertainty. And here the myth becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Because modern culture often tells two contradictory stories at the same time. The first story celebrates boldness. Take risks. Follow your dreams. Challenge convention. The second story quietly rewards predictability. Stay safe. Minimize failure. Remain inside approved boundaries. Most people spend their lives trapped between these competing messages. And that tension creates a psychological crisis. We admire those who step beyond the line, but we hesitate to become them. We celebrate courage in retrospect while fearing it in the present. That paradox is not accidental. It reveals something profound about how societies function. Every civilization needs stability. Without structure, communities collapse. Without rules, trust disappears. Without boundaries, progress becomes chaos. Yet every civilization also depends on individuals willing to challenge existing boundaries. Without them, discovery stops. Innovation slows. Culture stagnates. Suddenly the conflict is no longer personal. It becomes systemic. The same force that protects a society can eventually limit its growth. The same force that creates growth can eventually threaten stability. Neither side is completely right. Neither side is completely wrong. And that is where the deepest contradiction begins to emerge. The figure represented by the cautious architect and the figure represented by the boundary breaker are not enemies. They need each other. One preserves the world. The other expands it. Yet history rarely remembers them equally. Think about the memory fragments that remain. A pair of wings. A brilliant sky. A distant light. A vast sea waiting below. Why do these images survive? Because they symbolize a choice every generation must make. Not whether to avoid consequences. Consequences are unavoidable. The real choice is what kind of consequences a person is willing to accept. The consequence of action. Or the consequence of inaction. And that may be the hidden crisis at the center of the myth. Perhaps the greatest risk is not reaching too far. Perhaps the greatest risk is spending an entire life never discovering what lies beyond the horizon of your current self. Notice how different that interpretation feels. The focus shifts away from punishment. Away from failure. Away from simple moral lessons. Instead, the story begins asking a more unsettling question. What happens when a human being values transformation more than preservation? That question becomes even more mysterious when we consider one final possibility. What if the thing being pursued was never an external destination at all? What if the true journey was inward? Because if that is the case, then the symbol that has fascinated humanity for thousands of years may not represent a place to reach. It may represent a version of oneself that can only be discovered by crossing a boundary that others refuse to cross. And if that is true, then the mystery is no longer about where the journey ended. The mystery is whether the person who began the journey was ever the same person who reached its highest point. The possibility that the journey was inward forces us to confront an entirely different interpretation of the myth. What if the central figure was never pursuing an object, a destination, or even an achievement? What if he was pursuing a state of being? This is where one of the deepest revelations begins to emerge. Throughout history, many of the stories that survive are not really about what their characters obtain. They are about what their characters become. The external narrative acts as a container for an internal transformation. And once we look through that lens, the symbols begin rearranging themselves. The wings are no longer merely a tool. They become a symbol of human potential. The sea is no longer merely a consequence. It becomes a symbol of reality, the world that eventually confronts every dream. And the sun becomes something even more profound. Not an enemy. Not a reward. A mirror. A mirror reflecting the deepest desire hidden inside the individual who chooses to move toward it. This creates a fascinating contradiction. Most people believe freedom means the absence of limits. Yet every meaningful pursuit requires accepting limits of a different kind. The artist sacrifices certainty for expression. The explorer sacrifices comfort for discovery. The innovator sacrifices approval for vision. Freedom, in its highest form, often demands a price. And perhaps that is the revelation hidden beneath the surface of the myth. The central figure is not defined by the outcome. He is defined by the willingness to pay the cost associated with becoming who he believes he must become. That distinction matters because it shifts the entire conversation away from success and failure. Success and failure are measurements imposed from the outside. Transformation happens within. A person can succeed publicly and remain unchanged. A person can fail publicly and be transformed forever. Suddenly the memory fragment of the wings takes on a different meaning. The image that remains in cultural memory is not a trophy. It is not a crown. It is not evidence of victory. It is evidence of movement beyond a previous self. And that may explain why the myth continues to resonate across centuries. Human beings are not only survival-oriented creatures. We are meaning-seeking creatures. We do not merely ask how to live. We ask why. We do not merely seek security. We seek significance. This is where the scale expands beyond the individual and into civilization itself. Entire cultures are shaped by the tension between preservation and transformation. Some societies become obsessed with stability and slowly lose their capacity for renewal. Others become obsessed with disruption and lose their capacity for continuity. The healthiest civilizations somehow maintain a dialogue between the two. They preserve enough to survive and challenge enough to evolve. In that sense, the central figure of the myth becomes more than a character. He becomes an enduring archetype. The force that refuses stagnation. The impulse that drives humanity beyond its current horizon. Yet an unresolved mystery remains. If the true value of the journey lies in transformation rather than achievement, then a disturbing question appears. How do we know whether a pursuit is leading us toward genuine transformation or merely toward self-destruction disguised as meaning? That question changes everything, because the answer may determine whether the figure at the center of the myth represents wisdom, delusion, or something far more complicated than either one. The question we arrived at is deceptively simple. How can a person distinguish between genuine transformation and self-destruction? Most interpretations stop there, treating the problem as a matter of judgment, wisdom, or personal choice. But there is a deeper revelation hidden beneath the question itself. What if the myth is not trying to teach us how to avoid failure? What if it is trying to expose a misunderstanding about success? This possibility changes the entire structure of the story. We tend to evaluate human lives through outcomes. Did they achieve their goal? Did they win? Did they survive? Did they receive recognition? These are the questions history often asks. Yet the most enduring myths frequently operate according to a different logic. They measure individuals not by what they obtained, but by what they revealed about the human condition. This is the core revelation. The central figure is not important because of what happened to him. He is important because he embodies a truth that most people spend their lives trying to avoid. Human beings do not merely seek comfort. They seek significance. That desire is so powerful that it often outweighs the instinct for security. Suddenly the myth stops functioning as a warning and begins functioning as a mirror. The wings become more than potential. They become the burden of possibility itself. Every person possesses capacities that remain unrealized. Every person carries dreams that exceed the boundaries of daily life. Every person encounters moments when staying safe and becoming fully alive seem to demand different choices. The image of the open sky captures that tension perfectly. Not because it promises success, but because it represents the terrifying freedom of possibility. This is why the story continues to resonate across centuries. The central conflict is not between a person and a force of nature. It is between two visions of existence. One vision treats life as something to preserve. The other treats life as something to express. Neither vision is completely wrong. But the myth forces us to confront what happens when these values collide. And here the deepest layer begins to emerge. The figure at the center of the story may represent something that civilizations simultaneously need and fear. Every major cultural breakthrough begins with individuals willing to move beyond accepted limits. Yet every stable society depends on limits remaining intact. This creates a permanent paradox. The people who expand the horizon of what is possible often appear unreasonable from the perspective of the present. Only later does history reinterpret their significance. That is why the memory fragments remain so powerful. A pair of wings suspended against an immense sky. A distant source of light that cannot be possessed. A vast sea waiting below. These images survive because they symbolize a universal reality. Every meaningful aspiration contains uncertainty. Every act of becoming contains risk. Every attempt to discover a larger version of oneself demands the sacrifice of something familiar. The deepest insight, then, is not that ambition is dangerous. It is that meaning always carries a cost. The question is whether that cost serves something real or merely feeds illusion. And that realization leads to an even larger consequence. If significance requires risk, if transformation requires uncertainty, and if every civilization advances through people willing to accept both, then perhaps the most important issue is not whether the central figure was right or wrong. The more unsettling question is what kind of world emerges when an entire culture forgets how to pursue meaning at all and chooses safety as its highest value. If meaning carries a cost, then we eventually arrive at the question every enduring myth leaves behind: what remains after the choice has been made? Not the decision itself. Not the moment of courage. Not the moment of fear. What remains afterward? Because consequences are rarely limited to the individual who experiences them. They ripple outward. They reshape memory. They alter culture. They influence people who may never know the original story in full. This is where the legacy of the central figure becomes more significant than the figure himself. The most fascinating aspect of his influence is that he did not leave behind a method, a philosophy, or a set of instructions. He left behind an image. A pair of wings suspended in the imagination of humanity. A vast sky stretching beyond visible limits. A distant light that continues to attract attention across centuries. That image survives because it captures a psychological reality that never disappears. Every generation inherits boundaries established by the generation before it. Some of those boundaries protect us. Some imprison us. The challenge is that they often look identical until someone tests them. That is the consequence most people overlook. The individuals who challenge accepted limits do not merely affect their own lives. They reveal information about reality itself. Sometimes they discover new possibilities. Sometimes they expose hidden dangers. Either way, they expand collective understanding. The result is a strange historical pattern. Society often resists these figures while they are present and studies them after they are gone. Not because their choices were universally correct, but because their choices exposed questions that everyone else preferred to avoid. This creates a legacy far larger than personal success or failure. The legacy becomes intellectual, cultural, even spiritual. The enduring influence lies in forcing future generations to think differently. Consider how many modern struggles echo the same underlying conflict. People leave secure careers to pursue uncertain callings. Researchers spend decades exploring ideas that may never succeed. Artists devote years to work that may never be recognized. Entrepreneurs invest time, energy, and resources into visions that may never become reality. The details change. The structure remains. The conflict between preservation and possibility continues to shape human life. That is why the memory fragments retain their power. The wings remind us of potential. The sea reminds us that every choice produces consequences. The distant light reminds us that there will always be ideals beyond our reach. Together they form a symbolic map of the human condition itself. Yet there is another consequence that is even more profound. When a culture loses respect for those willing to explore uncertainty, it slowly narrows its own horizon. Innovation becomes rarer. Imagination weakens. Possibility shrinks. Over time, safety transforms from a tool into an ideology. And when that happens, people may remain protected while becoming disconnected from the very sense of purpose that gives protection meaning in the first place. This is why the story continues to matter. Not because it provides a final answer, but because it preserves a tension that can never be fully resolved. Human beings need stability. Human beings need transformation. We require roots and horizons, structure and exploration, wisdom and courage. The paradox is that neither side can completely eliminate the other without creating a new form of loss. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of all. The central figure remains alive in cultural memory because he represents a question that every era must answer for itself. How much uncertainty is necessary for a meaningful life? Yet even that question may not be the final mystery. Because before we can decide how much risk is worth accepting, we must confront something even more fundamental. How do we recognize the difference between a calling that expands our humanity and an illusion that merely disguises itself as purpose? In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing is not that this ancient myth survived. The remarkable thing is that humanity never stopped needing it. Across thousands of years, technologies have changed, governments have risen and fallen, entire worldviews have disappeared, yet the same tension remains alive inside every generation. Not because people continue asking how to avoid mistakes. People have always known mistakes are inevitable. What persists is a deeper question. How should a human being relate to possibility itself? That may be the final insight hidden within the story. The central figure endures not because he provides an answer, but because he embodies a condition that belongs to all of us. To be human is to stand between two horizons. Behind us lies what is familiar. Ahead lies what is unknown. Between those horizons exists a space of uncertainty where identity, purpose, and meaning are constantly negotiated. The image remains unforgettable because it captures that space with extraordinary precision. A pair of wings. An endless sky. A distant source of light. A vast sea below. These are more than symbols. They are fragments of a universal experience. The wings represent the possibilities we carry within ourselves. The sky represents the openness of a future that cannot be fully predicted. The sea represents reality, indifferent to our hopes and fears. And the distant light represents something even more mysterious, the vision of a life that feels larger than the one we currently inhabit. What gives the myth its lasting power is that it refuses to resolve the tension between these forces. It does not eliminate uncertainty. It does not remove risk. It does not guarantee meaning. Instead, it leaves us with a paradox. Human beings are fragile, yet we are drawn toward what transcends us. We are finite, yet we imagine possibilities that seem infinite. We seek stability, yet something within us continually reaches beyond it. This paradox echoes through history because it echoes through every individual life. Every person eventually encounters a boundary that feels both protective and restrictive. Every person encounters a moment when the safer path and the more meaningful path appear to diverge. Every person must decide how much of themselves they are willing to risk in pursuit of what they believe matters most. That is why the story continues to speak to the modern world. Not because it belongs to the past, but because it belongs to a permanent feature of human existence. The real legacy is not a lesson about ambition, caution, success, or failure. The real legacy is the recognition that meaning cannot be inherited. It must be discovered. And discovery always carries uncertainty. Perhaps that is why the image never fades. Long after the details disappear, the symbols remain suspended in the imagination. The wings. The sky. The sea. The light. Not as answers, but as reminders. Reminders that a meaningful life may require us to live with questions that cannot be completely resolved. And maybe that is where the deepest mystery has been waiting all along. Not in what happened, not in what was gained or lost, but in what continues to call human beings toward horizons they know they may never fully reach. Because if there is one question that remains after everything else falls away, it is this: when the boundary between safety and meaning finally appears before us, will wisdom be found in knowing where to stop, or in understanding why we felt compelled to move forward in the first place?